Hello, Jimmy. Welcome to the Wax Museum.
Hey, John, how's it going?
It's going well. Uh, New computer, so I'm figuring out all my technology, and I know we had issues on ADD Masterminds before, so I don't know why this new computer's not working, but I appreciate you cooperating with me and recording on your end to fix it. Um, Anyways, I wanted to talk about cancel culture. And I've been thinking a lot about it like from a broad context, and you did an episode in December from a church context, and I liked your take on it. You said cancel culture is when someone is outed over scandalous and reprehensible behaviors or comments and then boycotted for that behavior until they are run out of whatever positions of power and influence they may have in our society. And no matter how much that person may apologize or condemn their broken behavior, such persons find no room for repentance until their head is served on a silver platter. Now, about just general, or were you talking about like in church culture?
Well, I think that comment really is more about just broader culture, specifically. Although I think the broader culture does have leakovers and spillovers into the church, especially as church culture and our Western Americanized cultures kind of often have a way of blending together. But there's definitely some overlap there. But I think broadly speaking, that's what you see. And while the church may allow for some room for repentance and such things, we tend to allow some grace sometimes. But I think it can be just as harsh and vicious in the church as sometimes even in the world.
Well, it's an interesting place to be at, right? Because you consider like within the church we're supposed to believe in grace, and but yet at the same time you want to hold people accountable.
Right.
And so like if we just believe in grace and we never canceled anybody, well, that would be a problem, right? Because we would have tyrants running everything and we would have no accountability.
Right.
But you think the church would be able to do this better anyways than our society is.
Right.
So some examples, Mark Driscoll, that was a really interesting one because I think most of us, when that first went down, we didn't really have a clue what was going on. It was hard to understand because it's like, well, he didn't cheat on his wife.
Right.
He didn't do something, but it was like he was kind of a bully, right? Like he was bullying people and they considered it spiritual abuse.
Right. Yeah, his situation is a little more difficult, and maybe actually even a good area that I think that you could see with the church, where the church said, hey, there's something more that's going on here than the things we traditionally get rid of people for. Like, we traditionally like just to expel people for bad theology or not meeting performance expectations or having some sort of gross immoral failure that usually involves financial crimes or, cheating on your wife. But with him, we're just like, you're just kind of a bad apple. And he was engaging in some, perhaps financial mismanagement, misappropriation of funds, taking donations for one thing and then using them for another, which kind of technically is illegal from my understanding of things. But it was never 100% clear that's what happened. And I know some folks out on the blogosphere like Warren Throckmorton, or I'm not quite sure how you say his last name. But they called him out for some of these things and asked some questions, and there definitely seemed to be some financial irregularities, at least enough for enough people within that church to say, hey, we're not giving another dime. And then when Mark was finally outed from being pastor there, the entire place just financially collapsed behind him.
Yeah. And I saw him, I was at a Gateway conference the year that he resigned, and he was a very broken man at that conference. And just seeing how the congregation responded to him and everything, and it's like the media has beaten this guy up so bad and all this stuff. But I think what I learned a lot from Mark Driscoll was hearing a lot from the people who were accusing him of abuse and hearing people talk about that situation. And, like there was kind of this general kind of, Christian saying, we can forgive him. We can forgive him. And it was like, forgive him for what though? Like for whatever he did to those people? Like it's pretty easy to forgive someone for something they did to someone else.
Right.
And I heard a lot of people talking about that, and it's so interesting because it's like how many years later now, and I heard like Matt Walsh talking about the same thing. It's like you don't forgive people for something they did to someone else. That doesn't make sense.
Right.
It's not your place to say no, it's okay. And so the restoration of Mark Driscoll, well, there really wasn't. He just started a new church in Phoenix, right?
Right.
Perry Noble, that's another one. He kind of did the same thing, didn't he? Like where he ended up starting his own church after. But it's like
Second Chance Church a year later, just decided, hey, they've run me out of the church I founded, so now I'm going to go start a new one just across the street from where the old one was.
And that was he was I knew he had a drinking problem. I don't know he was abusive to his wife.
Yeah, I mean they never were 100% clear exactly with what happened with the wife. There was definitely some rumors and stuff, but I'm guessing she didn't leave just because he was a little tipsy. And folks who are drunk, also have a lot of problems associated with that. So she definitely seemed to be leaving him over offenses that happened, and there seemed to be offenses and accusations made against him. It was never 100% clear. So it's really hard to say apart from, the absolute drunkenness. But his church even stood up and said, there was some misgivings with his marriage, and his marriage was not in the shape it should be. But they never really defined that. So there was a lot of rumors around that. But now they're divorced, so it's all good.
James McDonald, I've never even heard of him.
Yeah, he's a pretty popular guy. He was for a number of years, and his biggest thing was that, he started using the church as his own personal piggy bank, and even to support a lavish lifestyle, including big game hunting safaris like out in Africa, all on the church's dollar. And then he was seen to be kind of, on some videos. They might have been a little gotcha with the nature of the videos, but it seemed like he was on tape consistently saying things that could be deemed kind of cruel for a pastor to be saying, and very authoritarian in his leadership style. And, he seemed to be surrounded by a bunch of yes men, and who were kind of enabling all of this, until he got called out for it.
Huh. And then Bill Hybels, there was a big Me Too situation where there was a big cover up and everything. He never came back, did he?
No, he's still gone, and I think they're probably going to be pretty done with him. I think I don't foresee Bill Hybels coming back, especially since the nature of his ministry was highly geared towards like corporate CEO, super pastor, leadership guru stuff, and it's kind of like if you're kind of accused of sexually abusing somebody because of your authority, it's kind of hard to come back from that, especially if he's not quite owned up to everything.
So I think, what you said in your episode was basically that there should be a restoration process, where we actually walk through these things with the pastor and allow them to go through healing, get them the help they need. This actually reminds me, I was listening to an episode of a podcast where they were talking to this woman who had been raped and how she sought restorative justice. Instead of going through the Canadian, judicial system to get this person incarcerated or, whatever those kinds of proceedings would take, like there's justice for something like that, right? Instead of doing that, she went the restorative justice route. And what ended up happening is the perpetrator went through counseling and basically he got taught why what he did was wrong, which, I mean, it's amazing to me that someone would need to be taught that. Right. But he went through that process, and then she sat down with him after he'd been through that process and was able to ask him questions about why he did what he did. And she actually said that it helped her situation, which I'm like is mind blowing. I mean, like that's got to be like the worst thing that you. And yet this lady was saying that like the restorative justice route was better for her.
Interesting. Wow.
And so, like from a pastoral perspective, if there was some kind of restorative justice route they could go through with the people that they actually did damage to, you know, just like, oh well, the
denomination is taking care of it.
The denomination decided you're good.
Right.
Yeah, but that doesn't solve the problem. There's all these people like, and I think what's really crazy about those kinds of situations is there's so much collateral damage. So many people lose their faith over something like this.
Right.
And so restorative justice, I think that's kind of what we're looking at here. And what's interesting is like when you talk about pastoral, there are multiple, you know, facets to this, right? Like where it's like, well, this guy's a, you know, heretic, that's why he got kicked out, or this guy had a moral failure and that's why he got kicked out. I think you mentioned kind of incompetence as well as a reason.
Right.
But do we actually cancel pastors over incompetence, or would it be more so like they just get fired like anybody else who's incompetent in their job?
They probably will end up kind of getting, I guess, more fired more often than not. But, you know, sometimes incompetence, you know, might be actually opportunity for a promotion depending on the denomination.
It's true.
You know, they're going to be like, I mean, it's kind of like government. Be like, man, you really stink at your job. Man, you would be really good at managing this thing. You know,
you're promoted. Well, and what's interesting, so it's like you look at that, right? And it's like from a pastoral perspective, there's certain expectations morally and certain expectations, you know, when it comes to your teaching, you know, that you got to be teaching the right things, right?
Right.
And then when you take that out of like a Christian context or a religious context, and you look at situations like Justin Trudeau in Canada, where he got caught with blackface 3 times. Like they found this old footage of him blackface. Right. And it's such an interesting situation, because I know of cases in the States where you would see like a Democrat who, you know, they found one photo of blackface and it's like, that guy's gone. Right. And I never really thought of this too much until Justin Trudeau faced this, that it's like when you have a Republican who, you know, it turns out he's unfaithful to his wife. It's like, well, as a Republican, he represents family values. Therefore, if he goes against those values he's preaching, then he should not be doing his job, right? Like he should not have that job anymore. And so if you are preaching wokeness, and now we dig up this dirt on you and find out that you did some really racist stuff, it's like that's how you get canceled, right? But for him, essentially what happened is like people are like, well, we know he's not a racist. We know that he's pushed for a lot of, you know, equality. He's done a lot of things, you know, to show that he cares about equality. And people gave him the benefit of the doubt for that reason.
And he's friends with Obama, so.
Yeah, there you go. Well, Barack Obama actually endorsed him, so that's the only reason I voted for him. I'm kidding. I actually stuck it to the man by voting for somebody that was outside of those 2 front runners.
You voted none of the above. That's
they were insulting my intelligence. It doesn't take much to insult my intelligence. So Justin Trudeau really didn't get canceled. And like, it's funny because there was that situation, and there was also a situation where like back in 2001, he was accused of groping a woman, a reporter, and that came out. And he just kind of said, well, maybe she experienced it differently than I did.
Oh.
Yeah. Which I'm like, really? You're like Mr. Feminist. It's kind of crazy. So, but I mean, this guy is basically pretty much bulletproof at this point. Like, I'm like, I don't, it's almost like Trump, where it's like he could shoot a person on Main Street and it'd be like, It's okay. It's okay.
Right.
But I mean, again, too, though, this is a guy who had gender parity in cabinet. You know, he made sure that we had the same amount of men, same amount of women in cabinet. And so there's a lot of things that he's done that are like kind of the woke things to do, right?
Sure.
So another example, Louis C.K. You probably know all about that, right? Where it came out that he was doing things.
Yeah, I know of it. I'm not 100% up on it. But I know of it. Like he did some sexual stuff around women.
Yeah, he basically made them watch him pleasure himself. That's essentially it. That's the most discreet way I could say it.
Sure.
But it was interesting. Like Louis C.K. is a guy that, you know, says so many like very wise things. Like one of my favorite things I heard him say is, the only time you should be looking at your neighbor's plate is to make sure they have enough. And I'm like, that's such a beautiful saying. And he's just full of those kinds of things, you know, where he's like, he's a great, you know, funny comedian, but he also has kind of this angle to it where there's like a certain level of wisdom. Right. And so it's tremendously, you know, disappointing to hear that, you know, this guy's doing this. And as a result, he ended up getting canceled. And it was interesting. I was just listening today to Joe Rogan's interview with Bill Maher, and he mentioned, like, Joe Rogan mentioned Louis C.K., and he said, and he just kind of brought up Louis C.K., like basically saying that, like, you know, right now within our society, we're built for conversation. We're built for verbal conversation as human beings. But with technology now, a lot of our conversation is textual. It's written down. And the way people treat verbal conversation is totally different from the way that they treat textual conversation.
Sure.
When you write something on Twitter, it's there for everybody to see forever.
Right.
Right. And so it was really interesting, like, that he just brought up Louis C.K. out of the blue there. And then, like, Bill Maher's like, whoa, so you still hang out with, like, Louis C.K.? And then they started talking about it, and he said, you know, Rogan said, I've heard, you know, I've talked to Louis about this, and he's like, not all the story that you hear in the media is accurate. And he said, but it's like he cannot correct the media. He doesn't have the right to speak about this because he's still canceled.
Right.
And Bill Maher said he's in a sort of purgatory and cannot clarify anything. And I was like, that's an interesting thing. So when somebody's canceled, the wisest thing they can do is not speak for themselves. Sure. Like it is unwise for them to come forward and say, no, but you guys don't understand. I was wearing socks, you know, like, you know what I mean? That doesn't fix it, man. Like, It's not helpful. So another one's Kevin Spacey. Kevin Spacey, he's been canceled, and I think we're okay with that. I mean, great actor, but what he did was terrible.
But, you know, the funny thing with him is I've actually heard, like, a lot of the things he's been accused of, like, now in court are actually starting to kind of unravel and fall apart, and some of the accusations have actually been formally thrown out. So it's kind of interesting to see where that may go.
Because what was really weird about the Kevin Spacey thing is that it was like him having sex with underage men, right? Or underage boys. And he initially, when he got accused, he's like, oh, yeah, I should have come out as gay and I never did.
Yeah, and it's like you didn't quite get the message, did you?
Yeah. It's like, that's not helping anything. Now I think you have the gay community really upset with you. Because now you're making like a connection between that and pedophilia. It's like, that's a big problem. Michael Jackson, I know he's not around anymore, but it's like with that situation, it's like with these documentaries that have come out and the fact that people could identify markings on his body that like they wouldn't see unless they were in that situation, you know, makes it like kind of impossible that they just made up these stories. And so it's like, so with Michael Jackson, like, do we stop listening to his music? Right. Like, and like part of me is just kind of like, well, is this music so good that I have to listen to it despite the type of person he was, right? Like, it's like,
I forget what comedian it was, but one of them, I listened to it on Netflix, was talking about like, well, how many kids is it acceptable for Michael Jackson to molest before we stop listening to his music? 1, 2, 10, and
yeah.
like whereas what his name, Chris Brown or whatever, beating up on his girlfriend and doing some terrible things to her, it's kind of like we're just like, oh no, we're done with Chris Brown, but Michael, we're okay.
Well, it's such a legend, right?
Right.
Yeah. Well, it was funny too because Rogan started talking about Elvis Presley,
Right.
marrying an underage girl. I think she was 16. Priscilla was 16.
Right.
Then you got Jerry Lee Lewis, obviously,
Right.
14-year-old girl. And then Charlie Chaplin. I didn't know about this, but Charlie Chaplin also had
Oh,
some things going with underage people, underage women. And it's like, so there's a lot of messed up stuff in today's society. Those same people would be canceled.
right.
And it's like, because all this information comes out. And like, part of me is like looking at it and I'm like, okay, well, if we look at someone who's given a certain amount of power, like someone who works with children and they abuse children, it's like, well, why would we ever let them work with children again?
Exactly.
Like, there's no reason to. And so I kind of think, where does that leave us with like pastors? Where does that leave us with politicians? Because like, even when I look at like Justin Trudeau and I'm like, well, do you think we could have a prime minister that hasn't done blackface 3 times and groped a woman? Like,
Right.
is that possible? Or is he
There's
like the
somebody else.
only guy that can do this job? Right. And
Can't find
it's,
somebody better.
yeah, yeah. And so I kind of look at that and I'm like, so, and I believe, like, I believe in grace, but I don't know if we give people back, the chance that they had before, right? Like, there needs to be accountability. And, in particular, someone who's abused their power, it's like, why would we give them all that power back again?
Right. Yeah, I think striking the balance is difficult, and I think that's where the concept of how the Bible talks about in multiple times how we need to love both justice and mercy,
Yeah.
and the two are not opposed to one another like we often think. When Jesus was dying on the cross, it was an act of justice, but it was also an act of mercy.
Mm.
And God is all about both justice and mercy, and never one at the expense of the other. And I think we often, just get to the place where we're either wanting to show somebody 100% justice to give them their due and cancel them, or we're just willing to be kind of like Michael Jackson and be like, well, we're going to let him slide. He's special. And we seldom actually ever go after these individuals with both in mind, and that kind of, I guess you could say, that restorative sense of justice that you were talking about earlier. And when it comes to pastors, it's, I can't say any church I've ever been in and where I've seen, a pastor who was caught in infidelity or financial mismanagement or something of that nature. They usually never come back to that church, and there is no restoration process at that church. It just gets handled outside by the denomination at some denominational level or at another church, and any restoration that happens takes place away from where the original offense took place.
Yeah. And I mean, a couple others come to mind too. You think about John Crist, right? That situation.
Canceled.
Yeah. Well, I'm like, does he get to play churches again after all the sexting? And I mean, like,
Right.
it's like people thought he was safe. He's a Christian
Right.
comedian. That means he's safe. And it's like, so what does that look like? Like, is there a restoration process for him? Because like, I have a feeling that what'll happen is he'll come back, but he'll just come back as like just this secular comedian, and he's not bound by,
Right.
this Christian kind of thing anymore, right? Like I think that's what happens a lot of times too. Like I almost think that's what happened with Josh Harris.
Right.
is that it was like, but he more so got canceled by the left. But it's like, well, I don't know what Christianity is supposed to look like anymore, because it looks like all my fundamentalism was garbage.
Right.
And so what do I do with that? I know I feel really bad about what I did when I was a fundamentalist. I don't want to be that.
Right.
And so it's hard, because it's like, I guess a lot of times we look at these people, you know, especially someone like Louis C.K., who's been such a big success, and it's like, is his life over, or does it just mean he's going to live a little bit more modestly?
Right.
Is John Crist's life over, or is he just going to live a little bit more modestly?
I think eventually they'll find a way to reinvent themselves. You know, I don't think, you know, you're going to find John Crist start stocking shelves at Target anytime soon.
Yeah.
You know, I don't think that's in his cards in the future. You know, there's still going to be something about him as an entertainer, as an artist, as a creator of things, that's still going to compel him to seek out avenues to, you know, entertain. And, you know, he may go back to what he was once doing, because I don't think anything he did was necessarily anything that would necessarily get canceled for in secular culture. Most people would just probably, you know, be okay with it. But honestly,
Yep.
maybe at some point he decided to focus on the Christian thing, because he noticed, you know, wasn't much out there, and there's a niche he could fill. But now that's, you know, going to be replaced by somebody else, and, you know, in good time. So he may not find his way back there. Because, you know, personally speaking, I thought he was funny, but not overly funny. And I feel like kind of like a lot of, you know, Christian artists who, you know, sometimes try to make it in Christianity, singing Christian songs before they like switch over to, you know, secular music or something. That's kind of like, you know, they try to get their foot in the door at the Christian level, because it's a little bit easier of a market to get into. And, you know, they have above average church singing ability or music playing ability, which is great for church stuff, but maybe not quite going to cut it in the secular market. And so they work on honing their craft there, and they're just like, see ya.
Yeah, and I think there are people that do that, and then there's people that are actually sincere about it.
Sure.
And are like, I want to make music for Christians. I used to really be all about that.
Right.
And I don't know. Now I'm just like, man, I just want to make music.
Right.
And I, you know, like there's a faith angle, because it's in me, but it's not really blatant in what I do.
Right.
And so, so another one I was thinking of too is Cameron Strang. I don't know if you know who that is, but he is the founder of Relevant Magazine. And it turns out behind the scenes, he was very domineering and was pretty harsh with an African American man. And it seemed like racism. And so I don't know all the details, but he's, you know, like he's taken a break now. He's taken a break. But as a result, that magazine has not come out with an issue since November.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And so it's like, it's a very messy situation. And I don't know if Relevant recovers from this, because at what point do you say, okay, we're going to give Cameron his job back? Right. Because it's like, I think there's a history there where he has taken breaks before. And so I think that there's, you know, maybe some people should not have a platform, right? And that's where I'm kind of at with a lot of this, is I'm like, well, maybe that platform was too big for that person, and maybe they shouldn't have such a big platform. I was listening to that Vox podcast, Mike Erie, and it was something that didn't seem like serious from a secular perspective, where he said that he had like an emotional affair with someone.
Right.
But it's like he's seeking restoration by taking a step back basically from the mic.
Right.
But he's still doing all this other stuff for Vox. And I was like, that's so I don't really know what to think of that. Like if it was like a church.
Right.
And I guess this is what you do for a living. You got to take a step back, but you can't take a step back completely, because you got to keep things going. And it's like, I don't know. I don't know what the rule book is for this. Like this whole cancel culture thing, I feel like we're just making this up as we go along. And we're like, well, I'm really pissed off at that person, therefore they're canceled. This guy, I'm not super pissed at him, so we'll just let him stand in a corner for 5 minutes, and then we'll forget the whole thing happened. Well, his music's really good.
Right. Well, I think there is a degree of making it up as you go along, depending on which way the wind is blowing in the culture. But also at the same time, it seems like to me, there's always this emphasis on the platform in relation to their character and their character failing. And it's like we sit there and talk about them like there has to be this grand restoration to what they once were. And while I think, the ideal, I think honestly, when you get into those situations where you do have a moral failure or something, or something that legitimately, disqualifies you from using that platform for a season or two or forever, why is the emphasis like, well, we're going to step away until things get better and he can be restored? Well, like maybe that shouldn't even be the focus. Maybe we should just be like focus on like, well, let's make this man whole again and then see what happens. And whether that is, a restoration to the platform again, or whether that is a restoration to having a nice job doing something else. It seems always a little strange that there's always this rush of, well, we got to get him back to the platform. And, I've seen that with friends of mine who've been, I have Bible college's seminary background, and I have lots of friends naturally who, are in professional ministry and stuff of that nature. And, just by, I guess, sheer odds of the numbers and statistics, I happen to have a couple of friends who've been caught in, sexual misconduct, adultery. One of them even got arrested for soliciting another man at a public park. And it was actually an undercover officer. And, stuff of that nature. And it's kind of like the emphasis was always, well, when can so-and-so be back in the pulpit? When can so-and-so be back in ministry? And my thought was, well, why are we even talking about those things? Maybe that'll happen one day. Hopefully that can happen one day. But we need to just focus on making that man whole, and whatever that ultimately looks like one day, we'll cross that bridge when we get there.
Yeah. And I think like the word restoration is kind of interesting too, because I was thinking a lot about, as you were talking, I was thinking about like my friend who was going through deconstruction of her faith. And she said to me, John, don't expect me to come back to the same faith.
Right.
I'm going to build something new. So couldn't that be the case too with a person who's gone through this?
Sure.
It's like this restoration is not going to be, me becoming the same, working into the same position I had before. Maybe I need a totally different position. Maybe my position will be behind the scenes now. Maybe I'll be advising the guy that actually is at the pulpit, or maybe I'll be writing for the other comedian, so that I'm not on the road where I'm tempting to solicit people for sexual stuff, right? But it's like transforming. And I mean, we all need to grow as individuals, and maybe we all have our like momentary times where we should be canceled.
Right.
Maybe we've had our moments where it's like, okay, you know what? I got to take a break from this. And I think part of this too is like just what people do becomes so core to their identity.
Right.
And it's like, if I'm Louis C.K. and I'm not touring as a comedian, who am I?
Right.
And it's like, it's incredible to me how many people don't feel like they're anybody without their platform.
Right. Well, it's like that one pastor individual I talked to you with about once, here in Charlotte, who had fallen out with his wife, and now he's, pretty popular on Twitter, and so has a pretty good following. He a year after he had a falling out with his wife and got defrocked from his church, he was writing a book about how the entire thing went down and how it was like just a spiritual shipwreck for him. And now he's doing ministry somewhere else far away from all his original plans. And it's like I was talking to this man in private through instant message online, because I had the privilege of actually knowing and interacting with him personally at his church, because I was friends with a staff minister at his church, and so rubbing elbows, I got to rub his, and I was talking to him about it, and he was talking about, well, those things were terrible that I did, and he seemed to be owning up to it, but at the end of the day, he wasn't really interested on how those things impacted his ability to do ministry. His ultimate focus was, pursuing his calling and his gifting and expressing this fire in his belly that God had welled up inside of him. So, being reconciled to his wife, just wasn't going to ever happen. And making amends with the church that he hurt just wasn't in the cards. He just, at the end of the day, he couldn't step away from ministry, even in the midst of a scandalous affair and practically destroying a church that he had founded and built up, within a few years. Like, they were, I think, like 700-800 people or something here in Charlotte. So it's kind of like, none of that mattered to him. At the end of the day, it was just all about his gifting and calling and the platform. And he was going to find expression for that, to heck with his character and where he was spiritually. If he didn't even have any sort of concept of needing to be spiritually fit in order to be a pastor of a church. It just, wasn't in the cards for him.
Huh. Yeah, but I think, I think about King David.
Right.
And what went down with him and Bathsheba. And that situation is, I actually heard a pastor preach about it, saying, you realize that if the king summons a woman to his room, that woman has to come. Bathsheba had no choice in this whole situation, which I'm like, that actually makes a lot of sense. He was a person in power. So really, it's a Me Too kind of scenario for her. And, as a result of, now, were there consequences still, even though David received forgiveness from God? I mean, it did change his job as king, didn't it?
Yeah.
And so how can we expect that things wouldn't change? How can we expect that restoration, is going to mean I will act like it never happened, right? It becomes a part of your story, and it becomes a part of, your ministry, is knowing that, well, this is what I did. So what do I do to make sure that it's not possible for this to happen again?
Right. Well, and
I think that's the change that has to happen.
It's interesting because the Old Testament, even after David's long and dead, continues to call out David over his sin with Bathsheba. And that forever taints him. It's not like the Old Testament just acts like, it never happened. And that's not to say there wasn't a lot of praise for David yet still in the pages of the Old Testament, or the New Testament for that matter. But it forever marked who he was as an individual, and the extent of the kingdom that he was able to have, and how that impacted everything from even to the extent of how it impacted he wanted to build the temple, and God was like, no, you've been a butcher, you've been a man of war. I'm not going to let you build my temple. Your hands are bloody. And that's to say David hadn't repented of maybe such things, but God was clearly like, hey, your platform's only going to extend to this extent, and I'm gonna put a cap on you, and it's ultimately for your own good at the end of the day.
Well, that's kind of it too, right? If your platform gets limited, it's probably for your own good. If the idea of your platform being limited would destroy you, there's something wrong.
Right.
You're way too wrapped up in this. It's actually kind of funny because I've been watching Gotham, and there's been a few times where people are like, the city can be saved without you, right?
Right.
Saying to Bruce, it's not your job to save everybody. And they say the same thing to Commissioner Gordon. It's not your job to save everybody. Right. And I'm like, yeah, it's funny how it's in our human nature to think, well, but if I don't do this, it won't happen. It's like, guess again. There's other people that can step up. In fact, maybe you need to hold back so other people will step up. Otherwise, they're always going to be dependent on you, right? And so there's opportunity in this too, right? To allow other people to shine, opportunity to be humble and say, you know what? my ministry will go on without me.
Right. Well, I was having a conversation recently with another minister at in the area, and I tossed the idea out there that a church is bigger than her pastor, which is kind of an almost unthinkable doctrine, and especially in evangelical Christianity today, where the pastor is pretty much the platform. The pastor is the church. The pastor is the ministry, and there is nothing that happens except through the pastor. And I was actually commenting on one thing I liked about a prior pastor that we had who had recently retired after 40 some years of ministry, is that the church has moved on from him, and not because there was this nervousness about our ability to do so, but because he grew the church in such a way that it was never about him to begin with. And whether he was there to perform week after week after week after week after week wasn't an issue. And had he been dismissed for some sort of moral failing or something of that nature, it would have been devastating to the church. I'm sure people would have been hurt, and that might have hurt the ability of the church to thrive like we have. However, I still feel like it's never been centered around him. And but you don't get that impression when you deal with a Mark Driscoll or James McDonald or Bill Hybels. It's like they leave and things implode.
Yeah. So it's like, so what kind of leaders are we being, in the stuff that we do, right? Like, is this something where, like, if I got canceled, would everything I've been doing just die?
Right.
I guess
I'll pick up ADD Masterminds.
Yeah. Well, I gotta say, I was very pleased with your and Theo's episode.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, that was great. I'm like, that's cool. I'm like, I've never heard you guys talk without me there. That's pretty awesome. Like, I've heard you guys individually, right? But yeah, I know you guys had good chemistry.
Yeah.
I don't know. I guess what I'm building isn't that big, though, so it's not like it's something that needs to be sustained without me, right?
Right. Yeah, there's probably not too many salaries dependent on your to crank out podcast after podcast, is there?
No. It's all good. So, I guess before we're done, I mean, what about fake cancels? What about these cancels that make no sense? Like Vince Vaughn, he shook hands with Donald Trump. Like, what do we say about that? Like, this is my thought. I was thinking, man, if people decided I'm canceled because of who I sat and ate with, well, kind of like Jesus, then go ahead and cancel me. Like, I did not want to be uncanceled by you guys.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, how silly is that?
Right. Yeah, that's ridiculous. And especially it seems like I think the fake cancel thing that you say is like, is people out there looking to, like, kind of a witch, kind of very Monty Python, like, well, she's a witch, burn her. Well, I mean, she's not made of wood, so
I was gonna write an article about witch hunts. I never finished it. I should finish that because that's kind of a fun topic.
Right.
I started
witch hunt.
I started reading about the Salem witch trials, and it's kind of interesting because it started with like some weird symptoms. Like, these kids were acting weird.
Right.
And so they're like, oh, well, maybe they're witches. And then all of a sudden they started looking for people that had the same symptoms, and they started, And so, like, just the way it's like a social effervescence. That's what, I remember what book I was reading. It might have been The Coddling of the American Mind. And the guy was talking about how there's a social effervescence. And basically what happens is, like, people bubble over with emotions, and it kind of intensifies things to the point where we're like, oh, we got to cancel Vince Vaughn. He shook the orange man's hand.
Right.
Yeah. But it's like, I just, like, for me, just that silliness. I'm just like, okay, you guys can freak out. That's fine.
Right.
I'll be here when you guys come back. Either that or you guys don't ever come back and I don't have to deal with you guys again. That's cool too.
Yeah. There's a good movie, by the way, if you want to ever see it, with Winona Ryder and I forget the guy who played Abraham Lincoln in The Last of the Mohicans.
Yeah.
The Crucible. Really good movie about the Salem witch trials if you've never seen it.
All right. I will have to watch that.
It's great.
Well, thanks for being on the Wax Museum,
Yeah,
Jimmy.
absolutely.
And what's your website? Is jimmystable.com? Is that
Yeah,
right?
still over at
There we go.
jimmystable.com until Christianity Today invites me to be a regular contributor.
There we go. We'll talk to Drew Dick about that.
Right. Him and what's his name? The missions guy. I forget. Ed Setzer.
Oh, yeah. All right. We will do this again sometime.
Awesome.
All right.